Hello, my name is Nolan Smith, and this is my presentation on how we can deal with grief and trauma. I chose this topic because it's very close to my heart. I've been dealing with my own grief for around a year now, and I was trying to see if there was anything I could do to make it better, seeing as pretty much everyone in the history of humanity will go through some type of grief or some type of trauma in their lifetime. I thought it was very important to try to tackle this subject. Some terms to know for this presentation are grief counseling, which is counseling intended to assist people who have been bereaved in coping with their grief. Complicated grief theory, which is evidence-based therapy designed to help individuals struggling in intense grief reactions that do not subside naturally over time, called complicated grief. Through my research, I often found that grief counseling was cited as being one of the most effective treatments of grief. I wanted to see what this career entailed. There are three main tools in the grieving toolbox, one of them being to let people talk about the deceased and ask them about the person, distinguishing grief from trauma. If the client is struggling to get an image out of their head or experiencing flashbacks, then they are experiencing trauma, which can keep them from working through their grief. Deal with any guilt they are feeling and help them organize the grief. Another way people find comfort through grief is religion. Ideas like the afterlife and reincarnation can make people feel comforted through the idea of a new beginning or that someone is at peace in the afterlife. Overall, the idea of a higher presence in life brings many people comfort, not just through grief, but through many things. You've probably heard the phrase time heals all. And maybe in some cases that's true, but I feel like it's a strong myth that time heals all, seeing as grief can last a number of months or even years. The idea that time heals all can have people thinking that they're abnormal for not healing right away, when in reality, grief is never on a timeline and no one can tell you when to stop grieving. Sometimes letting your emotions run free through grief is important. Postponing an important emotional upheaval can be bad. Although it may seem easy to just find an easy task to do or a menial task to do, sometimes it's important to let yourself have an emotional day and an emotional upheaval. And it's part of the process that goes through healing. Staying active and exercising during grief can be very important. It can release neurotransmitters and endorphins. Exercising is often a huge part of coping with a loss, as it's a good distraction. Going on walks and taking short runs can be a big part of the grieving and coping process. For me personally, sports such as basketball and baseball have helped me a lot through the coping and grieving process. Here's a small video with actor Russell Brand, where he interviews a grief expert.
Literally on page 1 of the book, said you don't do them in order. They're not a map. There's no one way to do grief. It's unique as our fingerprint. And it's interesting over the years how they've changed, because they've become these 5 easy steps for grieving. And Elizabeth and I both hated that then, and I hate it now. There's no 5 easy steps for grieving. And it's interesting on social media. Sometimes people will put in, oh, you and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross are just trying to neaten up our grief and make us follow your rules. And Elizabeth was a rule breaker. Elizabeth would hate this idea that there's these stages you're supposed to follow. So they've gotten a bad rap. The other thing is acceptance got a finality that we never intended. You know, when people say to me, how long am I going to grieve my loved one who died? I always go, well, how long is your loved one going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve them a long time. It doesn't always mean with pain. Hopefully in time you can grieve them with love. So that's kind of the background on the stages and a lot of my work.
I decided to host a survey and ask people what they thought about grief counseling and therapy. I posted the link and surveyed 40 people online with Google Forms. I posted the survey on Instagram and Snapchat. Most participants were in the 18-year-old demographic. Through my experiential project, I got some insights on how people use therapy and grief counseling. 50% of people said they had seen a therapist after a traumatic event, yet only 10% of people said that they went to see a grief counselor after a traumatic event. I also asked, what are some things you wish your school would incorporate in regards to grief counseling? Some responses I got were, I wish they actually knew what they were doing. Everything feels so artificial, and I was going through something. I wouldn't go to a school grief counselor. To be honest, I don't really know. I haven't thought about that. More breaks for students who feel grief at school, kind of like Wellness Center. It would be really nice to have a speaker on Zoom or a lecture given by a grief counselor. During this, they could talk about phases of grief and to give general tips for overcoming and living with grief. A lot of people are intimidated by therapy, and this would be an easy way for them to seek some guidance without the full therapy experience. I interviewed a local grief counselor named Sharon Norman. She said, moving on means a person has accepted their loss, but that's not the same as forgetting. In fact, as we get through life, these memories can get more and more integral to who we are as people. Someone recently sent me a very insightful TED Talk talking about how we can heal from grief. Here is a 5-minute clip from that TED Talk.
That only adds to the pain. So let me be clear. Grief is not a singular emotion that anyone can just move on or get over. It's complex. We grieve because we love. Grief is just love in another form. It's the yin to the yang of love. We never lose love, and we never lose our grief. It's a state of being. It's a process of healing. And what I learned is this: to heal, we must grieve. To grieve, we must feel. And to feel, we must be present. Even in those hard and uncomfortable moments that are so challenging to sit with. 2010 is the year that death came knocking on my door. It's 2020 now. It is a wild year. We are all experiencing loss and trauma of all kinds. And I want you to know, if you're grieving, you're human and you're not alone. Grief is a natural and normal response to loss of something we loved or valued. There are many types of grief. We are experiencing collective grief as we all go through this together. We have anticipatory grief of the loss yet to come. We have ambiguous grief, where you're losing not the person, but maybe who they were. We're all going through different losses, and we have compounding losses too. Grief that happens with more grief happening behind it before we can even process what's already happening. We have losses that are domino affecting and creating secondary losses. We are all going through this together, and it is so, so hard. The acute grief that we're feeling now and the chronic grief that we'll be feeling for years to come. And it's easy to think of grief in the hard moments, but grief happens in the happy moments too. With a marriage, you lose the sense of independence. With having a baby, you lose a sense of freedom. Those losses often go unacknowledged, but they're important to feel. You may not be able to put into words what you're feeling in your grief. It may feel like you're foggy or cloudy, or you're sick physically, or anxiety or depression. But whatever grief you have in your life, I believe that 2020 is asking you to listen. With each instance of loss and trauma, in the midst of pain, we receive an invitation to heal, to slow down, to be present, to listen and respond with intention. Healing for you won't look the same as healing for me, just as grief doesn't look the same for you as it does for me. We all experience it uniquely. Even myself, the different losses that I've experienced are all unique in their own way. But the good news is that grieving is a skill. It is something you can get better at. It took me a while to realize that my body was designed to heal, and that grief was working for me and not against me. As I improved in the areas of mindfulness and meditation and self-care, I got back to truly listening, because after all, our emotions are the core of being human. Emotions are energy, a frequency. They're energy, motion, in motion. And as we can feel them and let them move through us, we can heal. I think that's a big reason why digging our daughter's grave was so great, because they helped us with that motion, getting those feelings out. There's a narrative in our society, though, that emotions are bad, that if you're a man, feeling too much can make you seem weak or too feminine. And for women, that you can be seen as dramatic or too much.
I've learned that healing is very possible, and that you can heal from grief without forgetting who you are grieving. The opportunity of learning these things helped in my life and future. In conclusion, I hope that anyone who watches this knows they have a lot of resources to deal with grief, and that whatever they're going through, they can get through it.